All right, industrialization part two. Again, sorry about the way this is going today. um, other industrialists during this time, Philip Armour, meats, Gustavus Swift, meat packing, James B. Duke has a college named after him, tobacco. We talked about George Eastman and Kodak. Cyrus McCormick and farm equipment, still a company today. You either get John Deere or you get McCormick. Collectively, this group is known as the robber barons. And I kind of I'm very interested in your take on these robber barons. Like I said, are they heroes or are they villains? Probably the worst, most notorious of the bunch was John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller Center is named after him. He will dominate the oil industry. He will cut costs, acquire new technology, hires good managers and scientists, made secret deals with the railroads. His Standard Oil Company had 90% of the oil refining business by 1879. He used horizontal integration, buying out his competitors, and later vertical integration, buying oil fields, railroad cars, warehouses, pipelines, and other factories. Barrel factories, in fact. What's going to come out of this time is actually three new forms of management for businesses. We're going to have the pool, the trust, and the holding company. Publicly, robber barons like John D. Rockefeller said that competition was good. Privately, he thought it was bad and a waste, and it led to less profit. So what we're going to see first are secret deals between rival companies to set production limits to keep the prices artificially high. This is collusion. This was a pull. Each company would be guaranteed a share of the market. Now, these pools eventually fell, not because they were illegal, because they were perfectly legal at the time, but because they're not legally binding. If you want to see a good example of the pool, there's an episode of King of the Hill, cartoon on Hulu, where Hank accidentally sets up a pool among rival propane dealers. Really funny show, I think, anyway. So the pools eventually fell because it wasn't legally binding. You couldn't necessarily count on your competitor to live up to their deal. So what comes next is the trust. The trust is a legally binding arrangement which brought competing companies in the same industry under a board of trustees. To join, a company had to give the board a majority of its stock. It was given a trust certificate to guarantee a share of the profits. Standard Oil Trust had 40 companies. It was directed by 9 trustees that were all selected by Rockefeller. So you give up majority share of your company and you don't even have a say in the way it's run. But I guess it was better than getting crushed. Government and the courts were unwilling to curb the power of big business. In fact, in 1886, the Supreme Court makes a rule that's actually still precedent today. You're probably too young to remember when Mitt Romney ran for president. One of his supposed gaffes was he said, "Corporations are people to my friends." And, people didn't really like that. And, it's understandable why they wouldn't like that, right? But the truth of the matter is he's kind of right. In 1886, the Supreme Court ruled that state railroad commissioners could not regulate railroads because of interstate commerce because they went across state lines. Only the government could do that. And it goes further and it says that corporations are actually people, I guess vampires because they can live forever, and they had certain rights and were protected under the 14th Amendment. And this has never been repealed as a ruling. So in 1887, Congress wanted to make it look like they were doing something, though they weren't really. They established what's called the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC. They made pools and rebates illegal. It was weak and ineffective. They brought 16 total cases from 1887 to 1905, and against the railroads, and the Supreme Court ruled for the railroads 15 out of 16 times. I guess the 16th time the check didn't arrive. Big business lobbyists paid off Congress, basically. They will pass what is called the Sherman Antitrust Act, which will make trusts illegal, but it was worded vaguely, and it made it difficult to enforce. Though Teddy Roosevelt will use this in the progressive era for his trust busting. He'll interpret it the way he wants to. Only 18 antitrust cases were brought between 1890 and 1904. But by then, really, companies had moved beyond the trust, and now they were using holding companies. Now, we still have holding companies today. We call them vulture capitalists sometimes. Sorry if the video freezes up. It's kind of freezing on my end. I don't know if that's my internet or computer or what. Probably both. So what you had here is a holding company is a large company that runs other companies. Still kind of that way today. And what they would do is it would buy and run corporations that nominally competed with each other. Think of, you got a Citgo and you got a Shell. You think they're actually competing businesses, but then maybe they're owned by one large holding company. Technically, it did not violate Sherman. And it creates these really large companies, which makes it easier to create monopolies. By 1900, 1% of corporations control 33% of manufacturing output. 1910, it's 44%. Railroads will do the same. Now, eventually, we're going to have the Clayton Antitrust Act in the Progressive Era, which will make it illegal for a holding company to own companies that technically compete without the approval of government. We'll have some interesting examples then. Our next topic is the mass market. We're going to get into see sophisticated advertising. Department stores in the East especially become an experience. You go in there, they got water fountains. It's beautiful. Kind of remember that as a kid. I don't think it's that way really anymore. I remember a 3-story Sears. It's pretty cool. One thing that comes out of this era is the mail order catalog. Because of the railroads and telegraph, I mentioned before, you could send out these catalogs all over the country. People could order things and have it shipped to them in weeks or months. Very different than today. The first was Montgomery Ward in 1872. Then came Sears and Roebuck. It started as a 4-page and eventually became humongous. As a kid, we loved getting the Sears Roebuck Sears catalog for winter, so we could my brother and my sister and I could circle everything we wanted for Christmas. He-Man, Transformers, Castle Grayskull, G.I. Joe, whatever. My Little Pony, I guess, for my sister. I forget what my brother was into. Ninja stuff, probably. We never got much of that stuff, but it was fun. It's kind of something we don't really see anymore. I guess you have the Finger Hut catalog, but kids today just will not know the joy of the Sears catalog. So we began to sell things. And by the way, Sears was so advanced at one point, you could actually order a house. Basically, they sent you all the components for a house. All you had to do was put it up. It was pretty cool. So, that kind of revolutionized things. In fact, the Sears stores actually started as catalog stores, as a place where you could ship your Sears order someplace, a little bit cheaper for you if you just went to the store. And the Sears stores kind of grew out of that. Sears, there's not many of them left, I guess. So you begin to sell to different parts of the country and even different parts of the world. The Singer Sewing Company will become one of the first international companies. And this will lead America to become an imperial power. And we'll talk about imperialism in a few weeks. Technology greatly increases manufacturing output and changes the way that people work. Machines produced more in less time. Since they were so big, you now had to come to the machines. You're having the work week. Um, you could also use more low-skilled workers who you could pay less, especially in the textile and garments factory. Low-skilled workers were easy to replace, and you could pay them a lot less because there was always 5 people who wanted that job. There are some skilled positions like mechanics, but other people will become foremen or floor supervisors, part of that bureaucracy. Bureaucracy really expands in this time. Those floor foremen and floor supervisors got better wages and shorter hours. Many skilled workers will lose out to their job to unskilled workers. Workers had to work long hours for low wages, usually about 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. You're expected to go to church. What did you make a year? About $400 to $500. Now you might wonder, was that a good thing? Well, to live comfortably for a modest family, you needed $600 to $800. So what did that mean? You often had to send your children to work. You had to take in boarders. Some women did in-house work like sewing. The job market was also very unstable. There were depressions from 1873 to 1877 and from 1893 to 97. There were also periodic recessions, periods of economic growth, and downturns were the norm. In the 1870s, they lost more than 1 million jobs and 50,000 businesses went belly up. Wages were often slashed, hours were increased. So they're like, we'll pay you less, but good news, you get to work more. It could be very dangerous. The industrial work was often boring and repetitive. From 1880 to 1900, 35,000 people a year are killed on the job. 500,000 were injured, some due to boredom, most due to the neglect of the owner. There were no workplace safety laws. They also are going to see a rise in child labor at this point. Before, children had worked, but under parent supervision. Our notion of childhood is actually not that old. But now children left the home to work in factories. From 1870 to 1906, the under 16 working class went from 400,000 to 1.7 million. And they were paid much less, with as young as 7 working long, laborious hours. Many states did have laws forbidding child labor, but they were really rarely enforced. Employers began to have an increased power over their employees' life, expecting strict discipline at work. You could be fined or fired. If you were late, you had to you were forced to work a schedule with very few breaks. If you were late, you could be fired, as I said, or fined. If you were a child, that didn't work too well, so they usually just beat them. Terrible time. So mostly, in fact, in some places you weren't allowed to talk or whistle. Mostly you dealt with managers and not the owner, which I think was one reason, like in the old days, you used to work with the owner. He worked beside you. Now there are several people between you and him. So the owners began to see, I think, people as cogs and abstract. So, they're willing to have their managers push workers to work faster and harder and more productively. This will push some workers toward organization, but it's difficult to organize unions. In 1866, William Sylvis, Sylvis, creates the National Labor Union, the NLU. It is a federation of independent craftsmen. They wanted a federal law for an 8-hour workday. They wanted a Department of Labor, which won't come until the New Deal. Their membership will go over 300,000, all native-born white men. Sylvis, however, dies in 1869, and the Depression wipes out his union. Unions were seen as a threat. Bosses hired spies to expose union members so they could be blacklisted. During strikes, they would use replacement workers, scabs. Local officials usually supported owners and would arrest picketers. and could count on favorable court rulings. Unions could not usually support their striking workers, so there was always a time limit on a strike anyway. Now, union dues have strike funds, so, it's a little bit easier. We in this country have more strikes and violence from 1881 to 1905 than any other country in the world. 6 million workers participated in 37 strikes, including the Pennsylvania coal miners in the 1860s, where they formed the Working Man's Benevolence Association, the WBA. Many members were Irish immigrants. Some of the Irish actually formed their secret society known as the Molly Maguires. They tended to be more violent. It led to 50 arrests and many convictions on little or no evidence. 20 Molly Maguires were actually hung for murder, 10 on one day in June of 1877. On June 14th, 1877, and I throw a lot of dates at you, but there are some important dates I expect you to remember, and I'll let you know what those are. I just want you to be close. On July 14th, 1877, we see the largest strike in the country's history. It's called the Great Uprising of Railroad Workers. It begins in Martinsburg, West Virginia, spreads to Baltimore, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Chicago, and other cities. Thousands of workers participated. There was violence on both sides. They even brought in the army to put down the strike. You might think that's illegal, but actually it's technically not. They were declaring rebellion. Soldiers fired on strikers and their families, killing 25, wounding another 29. Strikers then attacked the troops and destroyed buildings and property. The press criticized the railroads for slashing wages, but they said that strikes were illegal and un-American. So it's like, it sucks you're getting screwed on the whole payment thing, but what are you going to do, man? There is also a problem with labor organization because of hostility among the laborers, which often owners fostered. It hurt the ability to organize. There is hostility between skilled and unskilled workers. And there are some differences in ideology. You have some socialists, not Marxist socialists, over whether or not to form. And there's some question of whether or not to form their own political parties. They will, in some cases. There's also division among races and ethnicities. There's more immigrants in the late 1800s. And that'll lead to a lot of, generally anytime a new group of immigrants came, they were seen as the enemy. An example during this time is the anti-Chinese sentiment, which we're actually going to talk about more later on. It leads to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The Chinese were blamed, and this will seem familiar, for taking jobs. African Americans face hostility from white workers. So let's talk about women. And 13% of women worked outside the home in the 1870s. By 1900 is 20%. Mostly of the women who worked were single and under the age of 25, often doing domestic service. Many will take factory work, and mostly in garment and textile, getting paid half or less of that of a man. Modern corporations did need secretaries, clerks, stenographers, and these were opportunities for native-born white women. Teaching, social work, and nursing all became mostly female occupations. A nurse named Clara Barton will create the Red Cross during this time. Women were supposed to stop working once they got married because you're supposed to concentrate on your man and children. Only 5% of married women worked outside the home, and frankly, that was mostly African American women because their husbands got paid less. Many will work in the home. Many African American married women will have to remain in the workforce, as I mentioned. Most Americans favored and supported capitalism. We produced more and more consumer goods during this time. There are new forms of transportation that allow most everyone to travel. The steam-powered printing press made knowledge more available. I wish more people read. Public schools will be expanded, and real wages actually did rise 50% from 1860 to 1900, but you kind of have to look at it with an asterisk. If you were a skilled worker, your your real wage went up 74%, unskilled 31%, and then you got inflation and other things. Andrew Carnegie and other robber barons championed capitalism, but they would construct a public image where they were seen as philanthropists. Cornelius Vanderbilt will defend the status quo, but he'll get a lot of money for charity. Carnegie will say that those who were like him were not greedy, they were visionaries. He will preach what is called the gospel of wealth. He said the super rich were necessary for a free economy, and like I said, they will use some money for philanthropy, mostly so the pitchforks don't come out. J.P. Morgan donated a lot of money to many causes. He's responsible for thousands of libraries across the country. When asked about poverty, they would kind of shrug and talk about the self-made man. The example they would use was a writer named Horatio Alger, who started poor and became rich writing novels, kind of the J.K. Rowling of the era. However, really Andrew Carnegie is probably they talk about the American dream. Andrew Carnegie is probably the better example. They basically said anybody in this country can become rich if you work hard enough. Though, some people are born on third base. Many of the robber barons will subscribe to social Darwinism, the idea that they take the ideas of Darwinism, evolution, apply it to society and people, survival of the fittest. Those who are rich deserve to be rich, and those who are poor deserve to be poor. It's really a pretty terrible thing. Nietzsche took it to its extreme, or Nietzsche, however it's pronounced. I basically argued that Christian kindness and charity was a mistake, that we need to let people die. We sadly have people who still believe that kind of thing. Many became concerned about the widening gap between rich and poor. There were 4,000 millionaires in the 1890s, while millions still lived in poverty. The haves and the have-nots. Many people argue that obscene wealth actually went against the notion of individual rights and equal rights and individual freedom. Henry George wrote a book called Progress and Poverty, which he asked the question, does industrial and technological progress mean that we have to have increased poverty? And he said, if it does, democracy is doomed. So he wanted to spread the wealth in some way. He wanted a land tax. It didn't quite work out. Another author named Edward Bellamy wrote Looking Backwards, 2000 to 1887. I saw America as a socialist utopia in 2000, maybe if Al Gore had won, I don't know, where the government controlled the economy and eliminated poverty. Basically, what he's arguing for was his idea of a cooperative economy. Obviously, didn't happen. We are going to see more organized labor. I'm going to try to keep this video at 30 minutes. Hopefully, it'll work. In 1869, the Philadelphia garment cutters formed the Knights of Labor. They wanted many of the reforms sought by the NLU earlier, but had some radical goals of their own. They wanted a cooperative economy, which was open to all workers. It became at first a secret organization. In 1879, it had 10,000 members. Then Terence Powerley comes along, and in 1882, they get rid of the secrecy rules. They had 42,000 members in 1882, 700,000 by 1886. They led to Labor Day in September of 1882, asking for an 8-hour workday. Labor Day became a federal holiday in 1894, so here we are. In the North, they included African Americans. They thought they needed to include all workers. In the South, they didn't. In 1885, they went on strike against the railroads and Jay Gould. The KOL was painted as radical and lost much of its own support. 1886 will be a big year. On May 1st, 340,000 people went on a nationwide one-day work stoppage, asking for an 8-hour day. 3 days later, we'll have the Haymarket riot. Labor organizers called a meeting at Haymarket Square for May 4th. 300 police to talk about their next go. 300 police officers came to disperse the crowd. A bomb exploded. The police attacked the crowd with guns and batons. In 20 minutes, 7 police officers were dead, mostly shot by other officers in crossfire. 4 workers were also dead. The next day, the police arrested 8 men who were known to be anarchists, hastily tried and convicted them. 7 were sentenced to death, 1 to life in prison. 4 were hanged, 1 committed suicide, and in 1893, a pro-labor governor in Illinois pardoned the last 3. The Haymarket riot led to a crackdown on organized labor. Workers will then begin to form labor parties and run candidates with some success, i.e. the governor who, gave pardons to the last 3. The Knights of Labor fell out of favor and will be replaced by the AFL, which will be led by the awesomely named Samuel Gompers, who owned a cigar factory. They accepted capitalism. They wanted to work within the system to get higher wages and shorter hours and job security. The AFL was actually only for skilled workers. It still exists today as the AFL-CIO. If you belong to a union, you might be under their umbrella. So that's everything on industrialization. Hope you enjoyed the lecture videos. I'll have some other stuff for you too. I hope you have a good week. I look forward to reading your all's discussion posts.